Is the title of this episode going to be California, a Fiery Hellhole?
I don't think so.
Isn't that the Fox News shit on California every time?
Hey, Jeannie.
Yeah, Brew.
Who's our guest on the Nerd Show today?
Today we have Eric Borden. He's a principal at Synapse. Good morning, Eric.
Hey, Eric.
Hi, Bruce and Jeannie. How's it going?
Going all right.
It's good here in Massachusetts. How's it going in California?
Always crazy, always fun. Looking forward to talk about it.
So you're kind of new to Synapse. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the kind of work that you do?
Yeah, so I'm a new-ish principal associate, working on a whole bunch of things already, some rate design, rate cases, and then continuing work in California and elsewhere on electric vehicles and wildfire work, risk work, but also looking at costs and things like that.
What are you going to tell us about today?
Well, I thought I'd go through a little bit of my experience in California, a little bit of, the California crazy that I've seen and experienced since 2015 when I came out here, and then talk a little bit more about some of the wildfire work that I've been doing. I actually came to California from Germany, where I've been doing some renewable integration research, work on storage, and I kind of thought, what better place to come? The nexus of cool energy policy and good weather, I think, tends to lead you towards California. And so I came out to California and was really lucky to get a position with TURN, which is a ratepayer advocacy group located in San Francisco. And when I got hired at TURN, I was actually the only internal analyst. They had relied on outside experts like Synapse. So I was lucky to come on and be the only internal analyst and get to explore a lot of different topic areas. What was going on in 2015, the SB 350 passed that year. That was a big environmental bill that ramped up renewable goals, doubled energy efficiency, and also gave the utilities a larger role in building out electric vehicle infrastructure. And so I actually started, probably my first case was on looking at electric vehicle infrastructure costs, what are the benefits to ratepayers, what are the risks? So the big focus then was on electric vehicles, but also DERs. There was a lot of talk about, well, what are we going to do with rooftop solar? What are we going to do with DERs? And I mention that because the landscape, when you looked at what utilities were doing, it was all about DERs, electric vehicles, all that stuff. Everything kind of changed in November 2018. When the Camp Fire happened. So PG&E, a piece of their transmission system failed called a C-hook, which basically held up wires on the transmission system. It failed and caused this horrible, devastating fire called the Camp Fire, which burned through the town of Paradise, killed 85 people. It was a really awful event. And it was negligence by PG&E that caused it. They hadn't inspected this transmission tower. They hadn't maintained it. And subsequently, PG&E went bankrupt. So that really changed the landscape. I mean, certainly one thing I like to say about California is that I think is true is it kind of runs at 100 miles an hour in every direction. Not always great from a policy standpoint, but certainly keeps things interesting. And so it's not that other areas have dropped off, but the main focus is now for utilities like wildfire risk. What should we do? It is a risk that probably was underappreciated by the utilities in years past. The Camp Fire made that more clear, and really all the utilities have focused more on wildfires. And so that's been a big part of my work in the last 4 or 5 years.
And what about your personal experience with all these fires? Have you been affected by them outside of your work life?
Oh, absolutely. I think almost all of us have. When we were in the Bay Area, we would have days that were so smoky. And we had, really young children, basically a newborn baby at the time. And so we'd be looking at the smoke maps and trying to find where's the little pocket that has some clean air. And I'll tell you what, we just were in Germany, my wife's family's from there, and we come back and we get back at night. We're oh, we're finally home, long flight. And we look over in the distance and there's this massive wildfire burning in the distance near our house, basically. And so everything worked out. We were actually the closest I've ever been to an evacuation zone. And this was just last week or 2 weeks ago. So yeah, it's an ever-present threat. There's very few places in California that are completely safe. I mean, San Francisco, for example, is probably one. Like there's just based on the climate and vegetation there, but most places in California, and certainly the smoke related, almost everywhere is impacted by it.
We had smoke here in Massachusetts from wildfires in the West.
Yeah, it is. It's one of those things that affects, and I remember there was one fire in Colorado that came out here. It's like, it's all connected.
So it's really hard when we think about the loss of life and how it's impacting so many people all the time. It's really hard to think about, is it worth it to do these upgrades or those upgrades? It's like, of course, you got to do them because something has to change. This is really not okay to have the utilities, at risk of causing this stuff happening again. And then from a policy,
there's not infinite money.
There's not infinite money, and we're talking about a policy perspective. So there have to be some choices. So how do you approach that?
Exactly. I mean, it's been some of the most interesting, fascinating, and difficult work that I've done. Just one kind of global thing to keep in mind that I do feel is underappreciated is that, as with a lot of these societal issues that we deal with through utilities, like just thinking about what should the utility do will not solve, the issue. Utilities are responsible for about 10% of ignitions in California. Now, many of those fires have been larger ones. So if you go through the thought exercise of, well, let's say we eliminate all risk from utilities, will that stop wildfires in California? No. And one thing I wish I could talk about more in my work is, when I started doing this work, I did this is how I get into topics is I'll do like a literature review. I'll go out and I'll just read stuff like, what are academics saying? People that have been doing this work for years. And I was surprised to find really heavy consensus around one solution to preventing and helping spread of wildfires, which is something called prescribed burns. The term that they use is good fire. So you actually intentionally start fires to thin out vegetation and to keep forests healthy. And we've basically gotten away from that in the West and towards a culture of just fire suppression all the time. But it is like a solution that is really well agreed upon in the literature that, should be a main focus for the state as a whole. So I didn't quite answer your question. I will get into how we approach, what should utilities be doing? But I think it is like a societal issue, just like climate change, just like others, where it has to be a full, government, private approach to it, not just like looking at, well, what should utilities do? Of course, we should look at that, but keeping in mind that these fake silos that we've set up as a society probably need to be broken down a little bit.
I have a friend who works in the UC system, Max Moritz, and he works on the Good Fires research.
What's difficult for me is when I write testimony on this stuff, I can't really even talk about that because it's not really under the jurisdiction of the CPUC. So I really look hard at what are utilities proposing, what are the best ways for them to reduce risk, but also keep in mind that, energy can't become a luxury good. It's already really difficult in California for people to pay their bills. We have the number one poverty rate in the country when you account for cost of living. And you have PG&E coming along right now saying we want $10 billion to underground 3,000 something miles of its system as part of a larger plan to underground 10,000 miles over the next 10, 20 years. They say 10 years, but I'm a little bit skeptical that that's a realistic target. And, that's 10 billion of 20 billion that they're proposing just in the next rate case. So we're looking at, really like unfathomable cost increases that, people can't afford and that, aren't really necessary actually to reduce the risk of wildfire in their system. So I've looked hard at that. And one of the things I did was I've looked at, well, what have caused the largest wildfires in PG&E service territory for all the data I could get, which is basically 2015 to 2020. And I found it in every single case for every large fire, right, that had a really big impact, every single one was found to be the result of negligence by PG&E, or the result of PG&E not following the law and either not inspecting its equipment or not maintaining its equipment, or not doing the vegetation management for which ratepayers have funded. So I actually didn't know that until this rate case, and just having looked at every single fire, that was the case. And so that actually wasn't built into PG&E's risk modeling that they did. But I do want to bring up this first slide that's titled Cost Effectiveness of Wildfire Strategies. What this shows is the blue line is what's called a risk spend efficiency metric. This is a cost effectiveness metric that we use in risk modeling that's defined as risks reduction divided by cost. So it's a really kind of elegant way to show in one number, based on their proposal, what is the risk spend efficiency, or RSE, of each program. And then the orange bars show just the costs of each program. So blue line is the RSE and the orange bars are costs. And what you see related to what I was talking about before is that actually these like basic utility programs around compliance with the law have the highest cost effectiveness, meaning they reduce the most risk for the cost. And that's very much in line with what I saw when I looked at the causes of the wildfires, even though it wasn't even built into the risk modeling. Just the results of their risk modeling, showed that those are the programs that need the biggest focus, and was very much aligned with the causes of the wildfires that we had seen. And so, the position where we kind of ended up was, look, undergrounding probably should increase, and probably there needs to be other measures like covered conductor. That's not shown in this slide, but that's essentially heavily insulated wire where, if vegetation comes in contact with that wire, it's much less likely to actually ignite a fire. So you look at costs and you look at what does it do from a risk perspective, and you think about how do you, balance those things. The RSE metric helps you a lot in that because that's what it's designed to look at. And then you think about, okay, what can folks afford and how can we do this in a more strategic fashion? So yeah, that's how I've approached it. Every case has been different because I get more and better data as we go along, which, makes my life better and easier. Like the more data we actually have versus just saying like, well, wildfires are bad, so let's spend a lot of money, right? And unfortunately, in the sort of later phases of the case, that's kind of where the rhetoric goes. But I feel like it's my job to put numbers to that and to show like, here's what the facts are showing. Like, here's what we can do to really make a meaningful dent and reduce risk, but also think about affordability and costs and all that.
What I take from this graph and what you're saying, Eric, is that kind of your position or Etern's position is something like, let's not rush to spend $10 billion on undergrounding when we're not doing these other things first that are more effective per dollar. And, spending $2 billion on vegetation management would be much more effective. And it's not only less money, but it'll do more for reducing the risks and the fires.
Yeah. And doing it well is key.
And then is PG&E's position, no, let's waste $10 billion and skip the other stuff that's required by law and common sense?
Well, it's not even skip the other stuff. It's let's waste $10 billion and do the other stuff because they have to do it and they have to keep doing it. So in total, it's $20 billion just for wildfire in this rate case. Of course, remember, they still have to, do capacity upgrades and do all the rest of the stuff utilities do. And so, another thing that you do in these cases is you say, okay, what evidence are you showing me that this $10 billion is warranted, right? So I am probably one of the few people who looked at every document that I could get about what is this based on, right? Like, what have you done? And there was really nothing there. I mean, this was an announcement that the CEO made that said, we're going to underground 10,000 miles. I have to tell you, Bruce and Jeannie, it's kind of smart politics in a way. People are really sick of seeing utility cause wildfires. And they think, yeah, let's underground these lines. That's a good idea. But I think that the cost of it is unknown and the execution risk is extremely high. It's kind of like, especially with the kind of planning detail that they've done, it's kind of like going into building a nuclear power plant where you don't even know how to design it or what reactor you're going to use. It's that undergrounding is a really complex thing. One of the other things I looked at was, well, based on historical averages, how long would it take them to do like what they're planning to do? And it was something like 2,000 years or something, right? Like they're planning on accelerating it so fast to an extent that they've never done before. And I've certainly not seen any evidence that they can do that and do it well. Like it's not just about underground, it's about undergrounding in the right places is really key. So I think it would be super risky and a really, really bad thing for ratepayers if this went forward.
And here we are at a moment in history where all those person years of labor in California might better be deployed on things like, kind of modernizing, grid mod. We're going to get a lot of electric heat pumps installed and DERs and all of that is going to require a fair amount of money and person hours, right?
Yeah, and electric vehicles, and it's we want to do all that, and all that's super important for climate. And so it would be a major problem with the focus of the company to have them shift towards, well, how can we get all this undergrounding done versus how can we comply with the law and get all our climate goals done and all that.
But I think what you're not looking at, Eric, is that these billions of dollars in undergrounding wires would be in rate base and they'd earn a profit on that, right?
I've certainly looked at that. Thanks for the segue to this second slide. So this was something where I really like to if there's rhetoric around something that somebody says can be done, I like to put numbers to it. I think that's part of my role in this space. And so this was to try to quantify. PG&E kept saying, well, we're going to actually save money by doing this $10 billion, or actually this is a lot more than 10 billion. This is the full 10,000 miles of undergrounding. And with revenue requirement, it's something like actually 100 billion. So I said, okay, I want to put numbers to that and use conservative from our perspective assumptions, meaning low costs, high savings numbers to show let's just see how this looks. And lo and behold, the cost of undergrounding is just so outweighs, reduced maintenance costs on the overhead system. I even looked at PSPS, which is, utilities will shut off power to customers to avoid wildfires. And so I looked at, well, what's the economic value to customers of not having that done because the lines are underground, right? Even with that value, the cost of undergrounding is just so much larger. So yeah, it just doesn't pencil.
Yeah, I looked at the transmission outages data from Europe for underground versus above ground lines, and the underground, the frequency of failures is less for underground transmission, but the duration is much longer. They're basically harder to fix.
Yeah.
And so you kind of get this trade-off between fewer but longer.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So yeah, it's not always as clear as you might think.
So hey, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, appreciate it.
It's great talking with you, Eric.
Good to talk to you.